August 1943, Eastern England, just after midnight. The countryside is blacked out completely. No lights, no movement. Only wind across open fields and the distant hum of generators buried inside low concrete buildings. Inside a cramped operations room, a single red bulb glows above, a desk crowded with dials and cables. Headphones crackle with static. Somewhere over the North Sea, engines are forming into line Sherman bombers climbing into the darkness, invisible to the eye but alive in the airwaves. Their radios whisper constantly, feeding navigation signals into cockpits lit only by instrument glow. The raid is already underway at one listening station. A U.S. radioman leans closer to his receiver. He twists a dial slowly, then stops. The signal doesn't disappear. It bends, bleeds, overlaps in a way it shouldn't. What he does next breaks protocol. He shifts the frequency against, lightly off, deliberately wrong. To anyone watching, it looks reckless, dangerous, pointless in the middle of an active raid. Another operator shakes his head. This is not how the system is supposed to work. But in the headphones, something changes. German transmissions begin to drift. Navigation tones slide out of alignment. Signals meant to guide bombers tighten, then smear into confusion. Outside, the night remains calm, but above it, an entire Luftwaffe raid is about to lose its sense of direction. Because one radioman decided to listen differently. By 1943, the night war over Europe had become a contest of systems rather than aircraft alone. After suffering heavy losses in daylight, the Luftwaffe shifted the bulk of its bomber offensive to darkness. Night offered concealment from fighters and limited the effectiveness of visual defenses. It also placed navigation at the center of survival. Finding a city in blackout conditions required precision that eyesight could not provide. Germany built that precision into a network. The Kammhuber-Lannan Integrated Air Defense System combined radar, searchlights, fighters, and radio control. For bombers, navigation relied on radio beams transmitted from Europe toward Britain. Crews rode these beams across the sea, following tones and signal changes that guided them to target areas with unnerving accuracy. Early in the war, it worked. British cities were found in darkness. Bomber streams arrived with cohesion. Defensive fighters struggled to locate targets they could not see, and radar coverage was still maturing. The air war at night favored the attacker. The defenders responded in kind. The Royal Air Force joined, increasingly by U.S. personnel, invested heavily in radar, listening posts, and signals intelligence. Operations rooms multiplied across Britain. It's responsible for piecing together fragment splips on screens, snippets of radio chatter, timing anomalies into a picture of what was coming. This was slow, exhausting work. Night operators fought fatigue as much as the enemy. Hours passed with nothing but static. Then, suddenly, everything mattered at once. A mistaken interpretation could send fighters the wrong way, or leave a city undefended. German success still depended on coordination. Bombers flew in groups, synchronized by radio guidance. Crews trusted their instruments because there was little else to trust. Once airborne deviation was dangerous. Lose the beam and a bomber could wander, waste fuel, or miss the target entirely. That dependence created vulnerability. As Allied monitoring improved, it became clear that German night bombing was not guided by magic, but by signals, predictable, repeatable, and bound by physics. Radio waves could be listened to, tracked, studied, but interfering with them was another matter. Jamming a frequency blindly risked revealing defensive positions. Broadcasting too strongly could alert German crews that their guidance was compromised, prompting them to switch methods. Protocols favored caution, observation, and gradual response. By August 1943, those protocols were well established. Operators were trained to monitor, log, and report, not improvise. Adjustments required authorization. Deviations invited reprimand. The system prized discipline because the stakes were national. And yet, as the Luftwaffe prepared another night raid, cracks in the system were already visible to those who listened closely. Signals overlapped, tones drifted. Guidance that appeared stable on paper behaved differently in real airspace. Under real conditions, it was within that gap between theory and practice that a single radioman's decision would begin to matter. Because the night war was no longer just about detecting bombers. It was about understanding how they found their way. German night navigation depended on order. Bomber crews were trained to trust radio guidance implicitly. Systems like Nicobene, Excurt, and Wigert projected narrow radio beams across the continent and over the North Sea. When a cockpit receiver stayed centered on the tone, the aircraft stayed on course. When the tone shifted, the pilot corrected distance, direction. Even bomb release timing could be controlled by signals the crew never saw. It was precise, and it was fragile. Radio waves did not exist in isolation. They reflected, overlapped, weakened, and distorted depending on weather, terrain, and distance. At night, when dozens of aircraft followed similar paths, signal environments grew crowded. Slight interference could produce outsized effects. The Allies understood this in theory. Listening stations across Britain monitored German frequencies constantly. Operators logged tones, pulse patterns, and timing sequences. Analysts mapped these signals to known navigation systems. Over time, a picture emerged of how raids were organized long before bombs fell. But understanding did not automatically translate into action. Allied protocols emphasized restraint. Jamming or spoofing risked escalation. If German crews realized their guidance was compromised, they might adapt quickly or switch to alternate methods. Worse, careless transmission could expose Allied listening posts to counterattack. Radiomen were taught to be invisible. They listened, they recorded, they reported. Deviation from assigned frequencies was discouraged. Adjusting dials without authorization risked contaminating intelligence collection. Any operator who introduced noise into the spectrum might mask valuable information or mislead friendly controllers. This discipline kept the system stable. It also kept it predictable. By mid-1943, German crews had grown confident that their night navigation remained largely intact. Losses occurred, but raids still reached cities. The beams still guided aircraft across the dark. What Allied analysts did not yet fully appreciate was how sensitive those systems were to near-frequency interference signals, close enough to distort guidance without announcing themselves as jamming. This was not brute force disruption, it was subtle displacement. A tone shifted just enough to pull an aircraft off-center. A timing cue smeared so release points drifted. A signal remained present, but unreliable. Asterisk to most operators. Such effects were anomalies to be noted. It's not exploited, but the radio man listening that August night noticed something different. As he adjusted his receiver, he realized the German signal did not vanish when he moved off the assigned frequency. It bent. It overlapped with adjacent bands. It behaved less like a fixed line and more like a flexible shape. This suggested possibility. If a receiver could distort the signal unintentionally, perhaps a transmitter could do so deliberately without broadcasting loudly, without triggering alarms, without revealing intent. The idea violated training assumptions. Radiomen were not tasked with shaping the spectrum. They were meant to observe it. The system depended on obedience as much as technology, yet the night raid forming over the North Sea did not care about doctrine. Bombers were all ready. Airborne signals were already active. Time was already short, and in that narrow window between detection and impact, the choice, facing one radioman, was no longer theoretical. It was practical, because if German navigation could be nudged instead of smashed, the entire raid might unravel without ever knowing why. And that possibility, once seen, could not be ignored. Night work broke people quietly. Radioman did not face flak or fighters. They faced hours of darkness, repetition, and the weight of knowing. That failure was invisible until cities burned. Headphones pressed into skulls. Static hissed constantly. The mind drifted, then snapped back, over and over, across endless shifts. Asterisk fatigue blurred judgment. By August 1943, many Allied listening stations operated through the night with skeleton crews. Coffee replaced sleep. Notes were scribbled in margins. Small anomalies were logged, then forgotten, because there was always more signal coming. The radioman who noticed the frequency. Behavior was not chasing heroism. He was chasing clarity. He had heard the German tones hundreds of times before. He knew how they were supposed to sound. When the signal bent, instead of fading as he adjusted the dial, it bothered him not emotionally, but intellectually. Systems were supposed to behave consistently. This one didn't. When he suggested adjusting transmission parameters, the reaction was predictable. Dismissal, skepticism. A reminder of protocol. Ideas that challenged established procedures were rarely welcomed during active operations. Night raids were not experiments. They were emergencies. Deviating from instruction risked confusion at exactly the wrong moment. The radioman understood this. That was why the decision felt heavy. If the idea failed, nothing would change except his standing. If it succeeded, it would do so quietly, without proof until later. There would be no immediate confirmation, no visible result, only the possibility that bombers might miss their marks. The human risk was not death. It was blame, and that, in institutions built on discipline, could end careers as decisively as bullets ended lives. German night bombing relied on cohesion. Bombers did not navigate independently. They followed guidance beams that kept formations aligned and synchronized. When those beams worked, raids arrived together, concentrated, overwhelming defenses through timing rather than numbers. This made the system efficient. It also made it brittle. A small disruption early in the route compounded. Over distance, aircraft drifted apart. Timings slipped. Bomb release points shifted by miles. What began as a precision raid degraded into scattered bombing. The radioman's frequency adjustment targeted this weakness. Instead of broadcasting noise across the spectrum, he nudged transmissions into adjacent bands close enough to interfere, far enough to avoid obvious detection. The goal was not silence. It was distortion. German receivers would still detect guidance signals. They would just be slightly wrong. This mattered tactically. A bomber crew that believed it was centered on a beam would make small corrections to compensate. Those corrections, guided by flawed input, pushed the aircraft further off course. Over minutes and miles, the deviation grew. Multiply that effect across dozens of aircraft, and the raid unraveled organically. Crews did not know they were lost. They only knew something felt off. Formation spacing changed. Release cues arrived. Late or early air defenses exploited this. Fighters intercepted isolated bombers more easily. Searchlights found stragglers instead of streams. Anti-aircraft fire covered wider areas rather than concentrated targets. The raid's strength coordination became its weakness, and all of it hinged on the subtlety of interference. Not enough to trigger suspicion, enough to break alignment radio. Navigation systems assumed stability. German guidance beams were narrow, directional, and precise in paper. In reality, they existed within a crowded electromagnetic environment. Multiple transmitters, atmospheric conditions, and terrain reflections created zones of overlap and distortion. Receivers compensated automatically. That compensation was the vulnerability. When a signal shifted slightly in frequency or phase, receivers did not reject it. They tried to correct for it. Pilots trusted instruments designed to smooth anomalies, not question them. The radioman exploited this behavior by transmitting near but not on the guidance frequency. He created interference that receivers interpreted as valid signal. The guidance tone did not vanish. It warped. This was not jamming in the conventional sense. It was misdirection. The brilliance of the method lay in its invisibility. German crews did not hear static. They heard guidance that felt unreliable but familiar. There was no clear indication of enemy action, no reason to switch systems or abort the mission. Immediately, technology worked against expectation. The very sophistication of German navigation made it vulnerable to subtle manipulation. Receivers designed to assist pilots amplified small errors. Instead of rejecting them, the radioman did not overpower the system. He nudged it, and in systems dependent on precision, nudges mattered as these human, tactical, and technological threads tightened together. The night raid moved closer to execution, guided by signals that no longer told the truth, which meant the next question was unavoidable. Would anyone in command allow the experiment? to continue once its implications became clear. Command structures existed to prevent chaos. Night defense over Britain depended on coordination across radar stations, fighter control rooms, searchlight batteries, and listening posts. Each node had a role. Each role had limits. Deviating from those limits risked misalignment across the entire system. That was the argument against improvisation. When the radioman's adjustment began producing measurable anomaly shifts in timing, fragmented plots, bombers appearing where they should, not supervisors faced an uncomfortable choice: shut it down and preserve protocol, or allow it to continue without certainty of outcome. Leadership at night was about risk management. The danger of allowing the frequency manipulation to continue was clear. If German crews detected interference, they might switch frequencies, alter routes, or identify the source of disruption. Worse, a poorly controlled transmission could interfere with friendly systems, blinding defenses at the wrong moment. But there was another risk. Stopping the experiment would restore a system that already favored the attacker. Senior controllers weighed incomplete information under time pressure. Reports from radar indicated bomber streams losing cohesion. Intercepts arrived late or off course. The pattern suggested something was working even if no one could yet explain it fully. So, Command made a quiet decision. They did not endorse the method officially. They did not announce it. They simply allowed it to continue for the duration of the raid. Leadership, in that moment, was not decisive action. It was restraint. They chose to let results speak before doctrine did. Inside German bombers, confusion grew slowly. Crews did not hear alarms. Navigation tones still registered. Instruments still responded. Yet small inconsistencies appeared. A correction here did not feel right. A timing cue arrived slightly early. Formation spacing changed without obvious cause. Pilots adjusted. They trusted the system because they had been trained to. Deviations were attributed to wind, turbulence, or human error. No one assumed enemy interference. There was no obvious signal of it. As the raid progressed, the effects compounded. Bombers drifted off assigned tracks. Some arrived over target areas late. Others released ordnance over open countryside, believing they were aligned correctly. The stream lost its shape, breaking into fragments that defenses could isolate. German after-action reports reflected this uncertainty. Crews described difficulty maintaining alignment. Navigational accuracy was reduced without clear explanation. Some suspected technical faults. Others blamed atmospheric conditions. What none of them realized that night was that their guidance had been bent, not broken. The most dangerous disruptions are the ones that do not announce themselves by the time commanders suspected interference. The raid was already ending. There was no opportunity to adapt mid-flight. No corrective order that could reassemble a fragmented formation over hostile territory. The Luftwaffe had been outmaneuvered not in the sky, but in the spectrum. War rewards obedience until it doesn't. The radioman's choice existed in a moral gray zone, familiar to anyone who operates inside rigid systems. Follow instructions exactly and accept outcomes. Or act on insight and accept responsibility. Neither path is safe. Breaking protocol risked reprimand and professional ruin. Following it risked lives on the ground. The radioman was not choosing between good and bad. He was choosing between known failure and uncertain possibility. That distinction mattered. The night war was impersonal. Bombers did not see faces. Operators did not hear explosions. Moral distance made obedience easier and innovation harder. The radioman bridged that distance with imagination rather than authority. His action did not require bravery in the traditional sense. It required accepting invisibility. If the trick worked, credit would diffuse into the system. If it failed, responsibility would concentrate on him. This imbalance discouraged experimentation by design, yet survival often depended on individuals willing to accept it. The moral dimension of the decision lay not in rule-breaking, but in intent. The radioman was not acting for recognition or defiance. He was acting because the system, as designed, was insufficient for the threat it faced. Invisible battles demand invisible courage. And as the night raid entered its decisive phase, bombers scattered. Defenses tightening. The consequences of that choice moved from theory into reality. Because the question was no longer whether the idea made sense, it was whether it would be allowed to finish what it had started. The signals were drifting, the formations were thinning, and above the darkened countryside, the Luftwaffe raid was no longer moving as one. August 1943, 1:17 hours. The raid reaches its critical phase. Over the North Sea, German bombers are fully committed, engines steady, crews focused on instruments glowing softly in darkened cockpits. The navigation beams are active. The tones are present. Everything on the surface appears normal. Inside the Allied listening station, the atmosphere tightens. Plots update on boards. Radar returns begin to show something unusual, not absence, but disorder. The bomber stream is no longer clean. Tracks fan slightly outward. Timings between contacts stretch. Aircraft that should be arriving together begin to arrive alone. The radioman keeps his hands on the controls. He makes no dramatic moves, no sudden shifts. He maintains the same near-frequency offset he introduced earlier, adjusting subtly to match changes in German transmission strength. The interference remains just below the threshold of obvious disruption. This is the danger point. If he pushes too far, the signal will collapse and alert the enemy. If he eases off, the guidance will stabilize. The margin is measured in fractions, small enough to seem meaningless, large enough to matter. He holds it. Minutes pass. Reports filter in from multiple sectors. Bombers are appearing off expected routes. Some are crossing radar lines late, others early. The coordinated arrival that German night raids rely on is dissolving in real time. Fighter controllers react. Instead of scrambling blindly toward a mass, they vector aircraft toward isolated contacts. Searchlights find individual bombers rather than a concentrated stream. Anti-aircraft batteries adjust fire patterns to wider coverage. The raid loses momentum. Inside German aircraft, the effect is felt but not understood. Pilots make constant, minor corrections, trusting instruments that insist they are centered. Bombardiers wait for release cues that feel delayed. Formation leaders struggle to maintain spacing as aircraft drift subtly apart. No one calls off the mission. There is no single failure dramatic enough to justify aborting. Each bomber believes the problem is local. Each crew assumes others are on course. That assumption is fatal to cohesion. Back in the listening station, supervisors watch the pattern degrade. The temptation to intervene to stop the experiment before consequences become unpredictable hangs in the air. But the evidence is now undeniable. The raid is unraveling. The radioman receives no order to stop. That silence is permission. As the bombers cross the English coast, the fragmentation becomes obvious. Ordnance falls across a wider area than planned. Some bombs land far from intended targets. Others fall harmlessly into open ground or water. Cities are spared concentrated destruction, not through interception alone, but through missile, MISA, LIGN. By the time German commanders realize something has gone wrong, it is too late to correct it. The raid has passed its point of coherence. There is no recall signal that can reassemble aircraft already scattered across hostile airspace. The radioman maintains the offset until the last bomber passes beyond effective range. Then, quietly, he returns the dial to its assigned position. No announcement follows. No confirmation arrives. Only the gradual realization, across operations, rooms, and radar stations, that an entire night raid has failed to achieve its purpose. And the reason is not visible in the sky. It exists only in the airwaves, where one deviation, sustained just long enough, has exposed the fragility of a system thought to be unbreakable. 2:03 hours. The raid is breaking apart. Radar plots no longer resemble a stream. They look like scattered threads, crossing lines at odd angles, some turning back early, others wandering far beyond planned routes. Fighter controllers adjust constantly, no longer reacting to a single mass, but to dozens of isolated problems. The effect compounds. Searchlights catch lone bombers drifting without escort. Anti-aircraft batteries track aircraft that should never have been there. Interceptors find targets without having to penetrate defensive screens. What should have been a synchronized assault becomes a series of disconnected intrusions. Inside German bombers, doubt creeps in. Pilots glance repeatedly at instruments that insist everything is correct. Navigators recheck calculations that no longer align with visual cues. Some crews realize they are off course only after seeing coastline features that should not be there, or not seeing them when they should. Bomb release becomes guesswork. Without precise timing signals, bombardiers rely on dead reckoning. Ordnance falls wide. Loads are jettisoned early or late. Targets are missed not by hundreds of yards, but by miles. German command begins to sense the scale of the failure. Communications increase. Questions replace instructions. Controllers attempt to reorient aircraft already deep over enemy territory, but radio traffic grows confused as crews report conflicting positions. The coherence that made night raids effective is gone. By the time surviving bombers turn back toward the continent, the outcome is irreversible. Losses are higher than expected, not catastrophic, but significant. More important than the aircraft lost is the confidence lost. System trusted implicitly has failed without visible cause. Back at Allied stations, the atmosphere remains restrained. There is no cheering. No declaration of victory, only verification. Analysts compare plots, timings, and reports. The pattern is unmistakable. The raid's effectiveness has collapsed not because of interception alone, but because navigation failed collectively. Attention turns to the listening station. Not openly, not officially. Quietly, the radioman's logs are reviewed. Frequency settings are examined. Timing adjustments are compared against radar anomalies. A correlation emerges. 2. Consistent to ignore. Commanders understand what has happened. They also understand what it means. The Luftwaffe's night bombing doctrine depends on radio guidance. If that guidance can be distorted without announcing interference, the entire system is vulnerable. Night no longer guarantees protection. Darkness no longer hides cohesion. The turning point is complete, not because bombers were destroyed in flames, but because certainty has been shattered. The Germans will continue to bomb. The war will continue. But the invisible advantage that once made night raids devastating has been compromised, and the radioman, still sitting at his station, does not celebrate. He removes his headphones slowly, ears ringing with silence where guidance once flowed cleanly. What he has done will not appear in headlines, but it has changed the nature of the night war. The immediate aftermath unfolded without ceremony. Dawn revealed no single moment of triumph. No decisive interception to point to. No burning formation photographed against the sky. Instead, assessment came through data. Bomb damage reports showed dispersion rather than concentration. Targets expected to be struck heavily had been missed or hit lightly. Rural areas absorbed ordnance meant for cities. For the defenders, that pattern mattered. Analysts compared radar tracks with bombing results and saw the same irregularity repeated across sectors. Bomber streams that should have arrived in tight windows had drifted apart by minutes. Some aircraft turned back early. Others crossed coastlines at unexpected points. The raid's signature, its timing and cohesion, had been compromised. On the German side, explanations were fragmented within the Luftwaffe. Initial reports blamed weather, equipment faults, and crew error. Night navigation was complex, and small deviations were common. But the scale of inconsistency troubled planners. Too many crews reported minor issues that produced major Quanzig's confidence. Confidence eroded quietly. Night raids depended on trust in beams, in timing, in the assumption that dozens of aircraft were seeing the same guidance. When that trust faltered, the doctrine that protected crews in darkness weakened with it. For Allied command, conclusions were cautious. The Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces did not issue immediate announcements or claims. They studied, they cross-checked, they ensured the effect was repeatable and not coincidental. Attention remained focused on the mechanism, not the individual. The radioman was questioned, not as a suspect, but as a source of insight. What exactly had been adjusted? How stable was the interference. How narrow was the margin between distortion and detection? The answers were precise, technical, and grounded in observation rather than theory. That mattered because if the effect could be reduced deliberately and controlled, it represented a new class of defensive action, one that did not rely on fighters, guns, or visibility, one that operated quietly, upstream of destruction by the end of the day. The conclusion was tentative but clear. The raid had failed to achieve its objectives, not because of superior interception, but because guidance had been compromised in a way the enemy did not immediately perceive. The implications extended beyond a single night. If radio navigation could be bent without breaking, then future raids could be shaped before they ever reached the coast. Targets could be spared, not by stopping bombers, but by unthreading the logic that held them together. As reports circulated upward, carefully worded and stripped of drama, the system absorbed the lesson without fanfare. The night war had changed subtly, decisively, and the consequences would unfold over the weeks that followed. Change followed quietly. By design, Allied commanders did not announce a breakthrough. They did not publicize a new weapon. Instead, they folded the lesson into procedure, protecting its origin by making it look inevitable. Listening posts adjusted monitoring practices. Transmissions were studied not just for content, but for behavior. How signals reacted when nudged, not merely when jammed. Electronic warfare matured. Specialized units expanded. Engineers refined transmitters capable of precise, low-power interference. Operators were trained to work close to enemy frequencies without revealing intent. The objective was no longer to block navigation outright, but to mislead it just enough to fracture cohesion. German responses lagged. The Luftwaffe attempted technical fixes, frequency changes, procedural adjustments, tighter discipline. But each fix assumed the problem was mechanical or environmental. The deeper vulnerability dependence on unchallenged radio order remained. Night raids continued, but their effectiveness declined. Formations dispersed more often. Bombing accuracy dropped. Crews reported persistent minor navigation issues that defied easy explanation. The night no longer guaranteed safety. Darkness no longer concealed coordination. For the Allies, the impact compounded. Fewer concentrated strikes meant fewer fires, fewer mass casualties, and fewer emergency responses stretched beyond capacity. Fighters intercepted isolated bombers more effectively. Anti-aircraft fire covered broader areas with better results. Defense shifted from reaction to anticipation. The radioman's role vanished into the machinery. There was no medal ceremony, no official citation. This idea became process. His action absorbed by institutions designed to outlast individuals. That was the nature of electronic warfare, anonymous by necessity, effective by accumulation. What mattered was continuity. Once the method proved repeatable, it became routine. Once routine, it reshaped expectations. German planners could no longer assume their beams would guide bombers intact. Allied defenders could influence raids. Before aircraft crossed the coast, the balance of the night war tilted, not dramatically, but persistently. By late 1943 and into 1944, the Luftwaffe's night offensive lost momentum. Resource shortages played a role. So did Allied air superiority by day. But the erosion of navigational certainty accelerated the decline. The war would not be won by radio alone, but it would be made shorter and less deadly by those who learned to fight where no one could see. And that lesson, once learned, would never be forgotten. War is often remembered for what is visible. Aircraft burning against the sky, cities shattered by impact, soldiers advancing across ground that can be photographed and mapped. But some of the most decisive battles leave no craters and claim no trophies. They exist in silence. The night raid exposed by one. Radioman did not fail because German pilots lacked courage or skill. It failed because a system built on precision was nudged into uncertainty. The guidance beams still existed. The radios still worked. But trust absolute, unexamined trust was broken. That is the quiet power of electronic warfare. It does not confront force with force. It confronts assumption with doubt. It exploits the gap between what machines promise and what reality delivers. In that gap, entire operations can unravel without ever knowing why. The Radioman's crazy trick was not reckless improvisation. It was attentive listening, elevated into action. He noticed behavior others dismissed as noise. He understood that systems reveal their weaknesses when observed long enough. His contribution did not end the war. It did not even stop all-night raids. But it changed the terms. From that point forward. The Luftwaffe could no longer rely on darkness alone. Every signal carried the possibility of distortion. Every tone could be bent. The night, once a shield, became contested space history rarely records. The names of those who fight invisibly, yet modern warfare is built on their legacy in the understanding that information, timing, and perception can matter as much as bombs and bullets. The airwaves became a battlefield that night. Then they have never stopped being one. In August 1943, over a darkened England, a single decision proved that wars are not only won by those who pulled triggers. Sometimes they are won by those who turn a dial just far enough to change everything.